we came across very disturbing information at that time. It was actually presented to us where they had simulations about what will happen, the expected polar shifts and things like that, and the type of sea levels when they rise and so on, and which areas will make it, which areas will kind of go under and stuff like that. It seems like majority of the smaller places in Europe will kind of be not there. Areas in Asia as well, small islands, of course, will not be there, and so on. The maps will change quite a bit. Africa will end up looking funny like this, and so on. United States and Australia. In fact, there are some lands now that will come. So it seems like from the Australia side, there is areas that will rise actually. So New Zealand will become bigger, and there will be extra sort of islands or continents that will show up. That's based on this information that came up at that time. So one of our target area activity was to see what's the situation, how to deal with it, and where is that coming from. Once we started to investigate that, we came across very also equally disturbing kind of reality, where we realized that there has been a lot of cycles of resets in history. We came across information like this. In the older maps, there has been these Caspian Sea, everybody's familiar with it. It's one of the major areas in sort of Central Asia and Caucasus and Iran and this part of the world, and was a major part of the travel route, the Silk Road. You look at the cities and the villages around it, how populated it was, right? And then look, suddenly these maps were about 16th century, 17th century maps, and then look at it where it is now. It's almost become a crescent, and there's a lot of desert here. Okay, and that's only a few years ago. That's a couple of 100 years ago only. What's happening here, right? And that we started then to get this information, and we researched it, and then we came across a whole Pandora's box, or a can of worms, or a rabbit hole that was introduced by some of the Russian scholars in about 10 years ago, 2014, 13, around that time, where they've released a lot of, it was basically a disclosure of history. It's another alternative reality that was just introduced. And they talked about basically deserts being used as a weapon. I mean, in the middle of an area, you would just suddenly have some sand dumped and turned into desert. And if you want to find out who occupied the area, you have to go into archaeological digs and go deeper and go 10, 15 meters down to be able to start to see who is living down there. This is man-made, human-made. This is a weapon. And that was kind of the reality that was starting to show up. And it was kind of interesting and disturbing at the same time. This situation that was, or the disclosure that was released at that time, started to show us this. Maybe some of you know about this, the name Tartaria or the Grand Tartaria. And maybe some of you started to research this already. There's a lot of material that's available now by a lot of researchers about it on YouTube and the internet and so on. And basically, it was a huge, practically it was a global civilization, and it was believed that that is the survivors of Atlantis. So after the destruction of Atlantis, the surviving civilization from that point spread across and went everywhere in the world to repopulate and to re-establish civilization again. And it was a peaceful society, culture. It was responsible for a lot of what we see today as art and architecture and megalithic architecture and things of that nature. The evidence is there that this was a major civilizations that existed not too long ago. So we started to talk about this civilization that was discovered, not discovered, but really it was hidden and we started to learn about it. It was replaced by a whole different history that is bringing the Greco-Roman civilizations as the starting point of history. And nothing existed before that. Before that, Plato talked about this weird thing called Atlantis, and nobody knows anything about it, and that's it. Meanwhile, there has been transitions between Atlantis and today, and that transition civilization was around until the 1700s and the early 1800s. So it's not mythology. So yes, it had the flags. So the griffin is its symbol. They had, the empire itself had the owl, and the owl was a very interesting symbol for it. And there is a history behind it. We can go through it later. It had a population of 8 million at that time, which was in the 17th century, around that time. Anyways, it existed, and it's there, and there has been there are evidences of efforts to take it out of the history. So what happened to it? There is a term that's called mud flood that is floating around now, and it's kind of expressing the ending of this civilization. History looked, the world looked like this. If you look at Western cowboy movies in the United States, or if many of the European cities, you will see that the street level is really much higher than where the original buildings are, where the original entrances of the buildings are, and so on. So what happened? Where did that flooding come from? And it's not just water flooding, it's actual mud, right? That's created the earth, and then the street level just had to go above that. Okay, so there has been a disaster. I mean, if you imagine the buildings in a city in the 1700s and 1800s being just 4-story or 5-story buildings, and usually they have these high ceilings, and they get all flooded to such a degree that the street level becomes above them, you can imagine the amount of, it's almost like a volcano of mud that just went and covered up 20, 30 meters of destruction there. So you ended up with things like this, where you would build a city on top of another city. This is Rome. I always wondered like why the street level is not at the same level as the ground level, but that's kind of one of the questions. This happened recently in Indonesia, and I think it's a video. Let's see if it will play in this form.
This is Dabu7. I want to share with you guys here just a quick clip of the liquefaction that took place in Indonesia, showing exactly what happened to the landscape from this earthquake that took place.
So this is a live satellite image of an Indonesian earthquake that happened. And that mud flood, the hypothesis for that, what causes this is a phenomenon called liquefaction, where the earth suddenly shakes and vibrates to a certain level that it becomes liquid and like quicksand, like mud, and then buildings will sink in. So that's kind of a line.
From satellite imagery.
So that's actual ground turning into mud.
As it just gives way, like a massive landslide.
Okay, there are many evidence and videos and things about this, so it's a whole area that you can start to go and explore if you're interested in this aspect. So finishing this part, we move now to their architecture. So whatever is referred to as Greco-Roman, colonial, Baroque, and so on, this style of architecture is the Tartarian architecture. It is basically like any invader who enters into a country and finds out the archaeology of that country, deciding, hey, we claim it to ourselves. So the French will come to Egypt, let's say, during the Napoleon era and say, hey, the pyramids, we built them, kind of thing. Of course, this didn't happen, but something close to that. But that's what happened, basically, where all this construction, all this type of architecture was claimed by just Greco-Roman, that this was the type of architecture they did. Meanwhile, technologically speaking, we don't have the technology to build things like that today, from from stone till now. So, of course, the Greco-Romans walked in and they found this from previous times, at the times when Atlantis existed, and then the survivors of Atlantis after them. So when you have structures and stonework, magnificent stonework like that, you realize that this is a civilization with extremely high advanced technology. That's the Cairo Museum. You find it in everywhere in the world. Everywhere. In Tokyo, Japan, you would find structures similar to this type of architecture at a time before the Western cultures were able to open Japan. So to enter into Japan. So everywhere, Argentina, Brazil, you name it, Mexico. Okay, now we go into the megalithic architecture. And this is an amazing location in Iran. Just imagine working in a mountain that way, and in fact, it looks like it probably had bigger doors for larger kind of people, but then it got made into smaller size to fit smaller size people. But you can see the type of megalithic architecture and the work on the earth. I mean, this was engraved, a mountain engraved into this building, as opposed to being erected. It was actually almost like 3D printed kind of thing. This is in Ethiopia, Petra in Jordan, and so on, in Saudi Arabia. You see this kind of stonework. There's no way today with our today's technology to be able to work with stone in this level. Okay, the art has been magnificent, and to a degree that it cannot be replicated today. The symbol of it was a double-headed eagle. When the split in the civilization, basically a faction of this Tartarian empire decided to turn against it and take it over and turn it into what we have today as this dark groups that are kind of working behind the scenes to change things in the world. I've spoken with many artists, of course, and whoever studied art knows very well that there's no way to treat marble in such a way to be able to get this type of texture and level of detail. And yet it was done only a couple of 100 years ago, or it was there up to that point. The art is an area that is just a proof of the grandeur and the technology that existed at this time. Just the way, the symmetry, the perfection, and there's no technology today that's available to work on that. That's kind of what happened. Then we get into the Dark Invasion, and it seems like the portals were open for deals to be made with certain powers on the planet to allow some negative kind of entities and energies and beings to claim control, and it happened, and an invasion of some sort took place, and all the old cultures got destroyed, and they shown that in their artwork as well. Subjugation to ancient cultures and older cultures and so on. There was very strange shields and armors that were found in some of the museums of beings that don't have any openings for the eyes and no need to breathe or something like that. And yet you had armor that looks like this in the museums. And it just brought to question the nature of these entities or beings that kind of invaded or were giving reign in this world. And there is also a structure, a statue that has something like this, with this kind of worm-looking entity within some of these armors as well. So think of it in whichever way you would like to take it, but this is reality that exists in museums. The proof is out there, and it's a matter of doing a bit more investigation. Changes happening, taking over, and destruction of civilizations until we reached the level where we have now. That was the beginning of the final blow to the Tartarian Empire. It happened at that time, where there has been like 500,000 troops were going to Moscow at the time of the 1812. And it was like 50 miles long troops. For what purpose? I mean, it was beyond just going to that part of the world. And apparently it was just sent everywhere in the world. And as we know, then things, history changed quite a bit since that time. How did this happen? What happened? And why did we forget about all this? And we don't know anything about it. And it's not being taught in academia or in anywhere, except now in the kind of fringe conspiracy kind of so-called or labeled places. And a famous saying of Napoleon is, history is a set of lies agreed upon. So whoever the victor is who writes history basically agrees with a bunch of other victors to write history in whichever way they feel. Here is history, 1,000 years of phantom history, it's called. And this is the entire history that we have right now that is everywhere, whether it's in academia or religious institutions and so on. All this history goes down to one French Jesuit historian priest called Joseph Scaliger. He basically went through the entire history and rearranged it in a way that we know today. The entire chronology and which civilizations show up and which don't was decided by Scaliger and his team. And then the interesting discovery was that there has been a kind of close to 1,000 years of extra history that was added to our calendar. And again, that's something to go and investigate if you're interested, if you choose to. Welcome everyone that came now. We have been going through the history of the reality and the fake history and the fake reality that we've been experiencing, and trying to put things back into the proper realistic order. So we've been going through some of these details. So how this 1,000 years were added extra, there has been this, at the times, the expression of AD and BC was not existent up till recently, maybe a couple of 100 years ago only. And they used to put a small I to indicate after Christ, or the year of the Lord. So Jesus or Jesus we're using an I or a J before the number. So you would find that in many of the coins. So there's an I here, 6, then 2, 1. You can see the 1 looking like a Roman 1, but this looks like an I, right? And this is where the shifting happens. Now it's 1621 instead of 622. So suddenly history had 1,000 years added. And then they had to fill in the gap in the history by filling up all kinds of fictitious characters or bringing characters from the past, doubling them under different names, and we see them in history, but there's no reference to them in history and so on. So that's kind of how it happened. You can see again the I with the 700. You can see a J with the 760. So that's kind of how this 1,000 years were added. Okay, so enough of this. This takes us through where reality has been and the point where we are today. Now we are in the process of realigning again our reality.